Emily Carter had always known that life wouldn't be fair, but she never imagined it would turn so cruel so soon. When she was only 12, her parents died in a car accident that left her alone in the world. Richard had two children, Lucas, a year older than Emily, and Hannah, who was the same age. Lucas and Hannah made sure everyone knew Emily wasn't really part of the family. Emily did the chores Lucas and Hannah refused to do. She helped Aunt Susan in the kitchen, though she rarely received a thank you. She kept her head down at family dinners, listening to them talk about vacations she wasn't invited to, new clothes she couldn't afford, and plans she was never part of. "What do you mean? You told me it was there for me," she said, her voice shaking. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Lucas or Hannah had ever said or done. Her own uncle, the man who was supposed to protect her, had stolen her future. Her parents' sacrifice, her years of hope, her late nights studying until she could barely keep her eyes open, it all felt wasted. The next morning, she sat quietly at breakfast while Lucas bragged about the new car his father had promised him for graduation. Aunt Susan planned a weekend trip to tour colleges with Hannah. Emily sipped her cold tea, swallowing her anger and heartbreak, feeling invisible yet again. Uncle Richard didn't look guilty or sad. Instead, he seemed annoyed, as though Emily had asked something unreasonable. "Things changed, Emily. If she wanted a better life, she'd have to fight for it herself, no matter how unfair it was or how many nights she spent crying into her pillow." And though she didn't know how yet, Emily Carter promised herself that day that Uncle Richard's betrayal wouldn't be the end of her story, it would be the beginning. "Your father didn't leave as much as you thought, and I had expenses. Your cousins needed things too, you know." Emily felt the walls closing in around her. Her chest tightened until it hurt to breathe. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words caught in her throat. Uncle Richard turned away, already done with the conversation. "You can look into community college, maybe get a job," he said, as if it were nothing. Even so, Emily kept her hope alive like a flickering candle. Her father had set up a college fund for her before he died, a detail she had learned from an old letter she found in her mother's jewelry box. It wasn't a secret, and Uncle Richard always told her, "Don't worry, Emily, your college is taken care of." She clung to those words like a promise, letting them keep her spirits up when days grew darker. They'd say things like, "She's just our cousin, not really our sister," or roll their eyes when teachers praised her for her grades. Her teachers praised her dedication, and a few even wrote glowing letters of recommendation without her asking. Emily filled out college applications with shaking hands, dreaming of the day she could leave the cold walls of her uncle's house behind. Every night she imagined life on campus, living in a dorm, meeting new people, and finally feeling like she belonged somewhere. But behind the excitement, a small worry gnawed at her. Would Uncle Richard really use her college fund for her, or had he forgotten the promise he'd made? But Emily tried to ignore it. She studied hard because that's what her parents would have wanted. The letter from her first-choice college came in the mail, and her hands trembled as she opened it. She had been accepted. For a brief moment, her heart soared. She ran to tell Uncle Richard, thinking that maybe, just maybe, he would share in her joy. But when she handed him the acceptance letter, his expression barely changed. He looked at the paper, sighed, and then said in a flat voice, "Emily, there's no money for college. Your father's fund has been spent." Late at night, when the house was finally quiet, she'd sit by the small desk in her room, poring over books until her eyelids felt like they were made of lead. She believed that if she worked hard enough, she could win a scholarship, go to college, and build a life where she didn't have to rely on anyone else, especially not her uncle. Their mother, Aunt Susan, didn't like Emily much either. Susan acted polite when people were around, but as soon as the front door closed, her face would tighten into something sharp and cold. Emily would see her whispering to Richard late at night, shooting Emily quick, annoyed glances as if she were a stain on the couch that wouldn't come out. Emily slept in the smallest room at the end of the hall. It used to be a storage room, and even though they had cleaned it out, it still smelled faintly of dust and forgotten things. She decorated it with her old family photos, hoping the memories would keep her warm, but every night felt colder than the last. Everything changed overnight. One day, she had a warm home filled with laughter, her mother's gentle hugs, and her father's calm voice telling her bedtime stories. The next, she stood in a dark suit beside two closed caskets, hearing whispers of sympathy from faces she barely recognized. After the funeral, Emily moved in with her Uncle Richard, her father's older brother, who was supposed to look after her and keep her safe. But the kindness she hoped to find never came. Uncle Richard wasn't the man her father had once trusted. Instead, he was cold, calculating, and always seemed to look through Emily rather than at her, as if she were an unwanted shadow in his perfectly ordered life. At first, Emily tried to fit in with his family. School became Emily's only escape, though even that wasn't easy. Years passed slowly, each day heavy with silence and small cruelties. By the time Emily turned 17, she had become one of the top students in her class. Emily's fears proved right on a gray spring afternoon. She still remembered the day clearly. The words felt like a slap across her face. Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. That night, Emily lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, her mind spinning. But deep inside, something started to change. Beneath the hurt, a spark of determination flickered. Emily realized no one was coming to save her. Emily spent the next few weeks moving through life like a ghost in her own story. She still woke up every morning, brushed her hair, and went to school. She kept her head buried in books, hoping her grades might open some door, though deep down she knew how much college cost. He spoke to Emily only when necessary, and even then, his words dripped with irritation. She would come home from school, close her bedroom door, and sink to the floor, hugging her knees and burying her face against them. The sky was turning the soft pink of early spring sunsets, and the air smelled of damp earth and fresh grass. Emily bit her lips so hard she tasted blood but refused to let him see her cry. When he finally left, she stayed outside until the stars began to prick through the sky, her breath shaking. In that quiet moment, she whispered to herself that she couldn't let them win. She wouldn't let their cruelty write her story. But knowing that and knowing how to change her future were two different things. Emily had no money, no support, and no one to guide her. For a moment, the world felt peaceful, as if it had nothing to do with her pain. She took the old laptop her father had given her years ago, its keys worn smooth, and spent hours researching scholarships, grants, and part-time jobs. Her eyes blurred from reading long lists of requirements she barely met, but she refused to stop. Slowly, she learned about community colleges, online courses, and ways to earn credits cheaply. It wasn't the dream she'd held onto for years, but it was something. And right now, something felt, but then the sliding door opened behind her, and Lucas stepped out, his laughter fading when he saw her. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his tone half mocking. Emily shrugged, staring at the garden. "Just sitting," she whispered. Lucas leaned against the railing, looking down at her. "You know it's your own fault, right?" he said casually. "If you were smarter, Dad wouldn't have had to spend the money elsewhere. You were never really part of this family anyway." Tears would spill out silently, soaking through her clothes, until she felt drained and numb. Sometimes, she wondered what it would be like to just disappear, to slip away so quietly no one would even notice she was gone. But then she would remember her parents' faces, the warmth of their love, and the promise she had made to herself that Uncle Richard's betrayal wouldn't be the end. Aunt Susan seemed almost pleased to see Emily's spirit breaking, and Lucas and Hannah followed her lead, their teasing now edged with cruelty. Lucas would brag loudly about college tours, his new car, and the spending money his father had promised him. Hannah, meanwhile, made a game out of reminding Emily what she'd lost. "It must feel awful," she'd say, her voice sweet and sharp at the same time. "All that hard work for nothing." Emily learned to keep her face blank, to nod politely, and retreat into silence even when her heart felt ready to shatter. Scholarships were few and most required more than just good grades, they needed connections she didn't have. Extracurriculars she hadn't been able to join because she'd been too busy cleaning up after her cousins or helping Aunt Susan with chores. Teachers asked why Emily seemed quieter than usual, but she always brushed them off with a tired smile. She didn't want to tell them about the late nights she lay awake crying, the mornings when getting out of bed felt impossible, or the afternoons when she sat behind the old oak tree at school trying to breathe through the heavy ache in her chest. But it felt as if part of her had been hollowed out the day Uncle Richard told her the truth. Every smile she forced felt brittle, every word she spoke tasted bitter. The acceptance letter to her dream college stayed hidden in the drawer beneath her sweaters, its edges slowly curling as if it, too, had given up hope. At night, she'd lie awake, staring into the dark, trying to understand how someone she trusted could steal the very future her parents had worked so hard to protect. Sometimes, she would whisper apologies into the emptiness, as if her mother and father could hear her. She felt she had let them down, that she hadn't been able to keep their wishes alive. School was the only place where Emily could pretend, if only for a few hours, that her life wasn't falling apart. At home, the atmosphere grew worse. Uncle Richard acted as if the conversation had never happened, but his coldness sharpened. The worst days came when the emptiness settled so deeply in her chest that it felt like carrying a stone around. One Friday evening, Emily found herself sitting alone on the back porch after dinner. The words sliced deeper than she wanted to admit. That weekend, she decided to search for answers herself. The next weeks blurred into a quiet routine of school, work, and searching for hope in late-night hours. Emily woke each morning before dawn, dragging herself out of bed even when her body felt too heavy to move. Aunt Susan raised an eyebrow, her mouth tightening into a sharp line. "You're already living here for free, aren't you?" Mrs. Parker, her English teacher, called her aside after class one afternoon. "Emily, you've always been a hard worker, but lately you look so tired. Are you okay?" Emily hesitated, the words fighting at the back of her throat, but then she just nodded and forced a smile. "Just busy," she whispered. It felt safer not to say more. There were nights she cried quietly into her pillow, feeling the loneliness wrap around her like a heavy blanket. Emily could see how proudly he spoke of Lucas and Hannah to neighbors, their successes praised and displayed in the living room like trophies. In those moments, her fear and sadness mixed with determination. It wasn't grand or perfect, but it was hers, a stubborn, quiet resistance that grew stronger with every small act of courage. And though she didn't know what tomorrow would bring, she held on to the hope that one day she could look back and see how far she had come. She was still the daughter of two loving parents who had believed in her future, even if they were gone. And though she couldn't bring them back, she could still honor them by refusing to let Uncle Richard's betrayal define her story. Her own efforts were invisible, hidden in her notebook and quiet nights at the bookstore. But Emily reminded herself daily that her worth wasn't measured by Uncle Richard's approval. It was measured by the promise she had made to herself, to find her own way, no matter how dark the road felt. The exhaustion pressed down on her, making each day feel longer than the last. Yet, every time she felt herself slipping, she would remember her parents' voices in her memories, encouraging her to keep going. That silent encouragement was sometimes the only thing that kept her from giving up. Telling the truth would mean admitting out loud how deeply she had been betrayed, and somehow that felt too raw, too painful to share. "And who will do the dishes and help with dinner if you off running around for pocket change?" His voice carried through the thin walls as he bragged about a new gaming console Uncle Richard had bought him just because. Emily sat frozen at the small dining table, her hands still wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold. The money her father had saved so carefully, money meant for her education, was now spent on luxuries for the very boy who taunted her. The unfairness burned so hot it made her eyes water, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't change Uncle Richard's choices, but she could still fight for her own. Emily swallowed hard and nodded, pretending not to see the satisfaction in Aunt Susan's eyes. The owner, a gentle older woman named Marlene, seemed to see the exhaustion hiding behind Emily's polite words. "Have you worked before, dear?" she asked kindly. Emily shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, but I learn fast." After a pause, Marlene nodded. "All right. Come in on Saturday, and we'll see how you do." Walking out of the store, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, a small but real sense of hope. It felt like every door she knocked on stayed locked, each hope flickering out before it could burn too brightly. Her feet ached from standing all day, and her back hurt from lifting heavy boxes of books. But when Marlene handed her the small envelope with her first day's pay, Emily's heart fluttered. It wasn't much, but it was hers, earned by her own effort, untouched by Uncle Richard's control. She tucked the envelope carefully into the notebook under her pillow, as if it were a seed she planned to grow into something bigger. That night, she lay awake staring at the cracks in the ceiling, wondering why life felt so heavy on her shoulders when she had barely started living. At school, she clung to her books like they were life preservers, answering questions softly in class and scribbling notes until her hand cramped. During lunch, she would sit by herself on the far bench near the trees, where she could pretend that the world wasn't falling apart around her. She told herself over and over that as long as she kept going, somehow things would change. But every evening, walking back into Uncle Richard's house felt like stepping into cold water. The air seemed thick with things left unsaid, and the walls echoed with laughter that wasn't hers. One Friday, Emily gathered enough courage to ask Aunt Susan if she could get a part-time job after school. Even in these low moments, Emily still had small sparks of determination that refused to die. She started waking up even earlier, sneaking in an hour of quiet study before the house stirred to life. She kept a notebook hidden under her pillow, filling its pages with scholarship deadlines, college application essays, and the names of community colleges that offered night classes. Sometimes she would find herself staring at old family photos tucked in the back of her drawer, the smiling faces of her parents beside a much younger Emily. Those memories felt like warm light in her chest, pushing her forward when the present seemed impossible to face. At school, Emily's teachers began to notice the change. One rainy afternoon, Emily overheard Lucas boasting to his friends in the kitchen. Determined to do something, Emily quietly applied for a weekend job at the small bookstore near the edge of town. The first Saturday at the bookstore was harder than Emily expected. The days became a balancing act. Emily would wake early, go to school, rush to the bookstore on weekends, and still come home to chores waiting for her. Meanwhile, Uncle Richard barely acknowledged her presence. The silence between them felt like a wall that grew taller each day. Sometimes, late at night, Emily would run her fingers over the letters of her college acceptance, tracing them like a secret she couldn't share. Slowly, piece by piece, Emily began to build her plan. Emily's days settled into a rhythm that felt both comforting and punishing. Each morning she rose before the sun, slipping quietly from her room to study in the stillness before the house woke. The early light spilling across her notes was the only gentle thing in her life, a brief moment that belonged to her alone. Conversation danced around her, full of plans for Lucas's college visits and Hannah's dance recitals. At school, she worked harder than ever. She found comfort in the library's quiet aisles, where no one expected anything from her except to exist quietly. Her grades climbed, letter by letter, as she poured herself into assignments and late-night studying. Teachers began to notice her determination, offering gentle encouragement that she treasured more than they could know. It felt like a secret language shared between people who understood what it meant to keep going when the world seemed to be against you. One Saturday evening, Emily returned from work to find Lucas and his friends laughing loudly in the living room. They had clearly been drinking, empty soda cans and snack wrappers littered around them. As Emily tried to slip past quietly, Lucas smirked and called out, "Hey, charity case. Make yourself useful and grab us some more chips." His friends burst into laughter, and Emily felt her face flush. For a split second, she wanted to throw the words back at him, to scream out everything she kept buried. But she swallowed the anger, turned, and fetched the chips silently. Her silence felt like defeat, but it was also her armor. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Once, Emily gathered her courage to mention that she had been accepted into a local writing contest, her voice trembling with hope. Writing it out didn't make it vanish, but it turned raw pain into something she could hold, study, and learn from. But she also knew something else. Even in the darkest corners of Uncle Richard's house, there was a part of her that refused to give up. And that stubborn, quiet hope felt stronger each day, whispering that she could turn this pain into something that would one day set her free. She promised herself that these moments would not define her, but rather remind her why she had to keep going. Each insult, each dismissive look, each betrayal would become a stepping stone out of this place. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Marlene would ask about Emily's day. She'd wake in the middle of the night from dreams of her parents' voices calling her name, only to remember with a sharp pain that they were gone. Her hands shook slightly as she signed the forms, feeling both fear and pride twisting in her chest. This was the first thing in years that truly belonged to her, untouched by Uncle Richard's control. She deposited the modest cash she'd earned from the bookstore, the amount tiny in anyone else's eyes but monumental to her. Walking home that afternoon, she held the receipt tightly, as if it might vanish if she let go. Sometimes, she pressed her face into her pillow to muffle the quiet sobs that came unbidden. In the darkness, grief sat beside her like a patient shadow, never fully leaving. But in those same nights, she also planned her future, whispering to herself the steps she would take: save enough from the bookstore, keep her grades high, apply for scholarships, and one day leave Uncle Richard's house behind. Emily never told her everything, but even sharing a little felt like lifting a stone from her chest. "You've got strength in you, Emily," Marlene once said, tapping her gently on the shoulder. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Emily carried those words home like a small, glowing ember, something to keep her warm when the nights felt longest. Uncle Richard barely paused in cutting his steak. "That's nice," he muttered, before turning back to Lucas to discuss the weekend soccer match. The words fell flat, heavier than silence, and Emily felt her cheeks burn with shame. Later, lying in bed, she replayed the moment in her mind, each time wishing she had kept her mouth shut to spare herself the sting. After school, she would rush to the bookstore where Marlene always greeted her with a warm smile that felt like a secret kindness. The smell of paper and old ink in the store wrapped around Emily like an embrace, reminding her that there were places in the world where she wasn't invisible. At night, Emily returned to a house that never felt like home. The front door would creak open to reveal Lucas sprawled on the living room couch, his shoes kicked off and the new gaming console glowing beside him. Hannah would be curled up on a chair, scrolling on her phone, while Aunt Susan scolded Emily for being late even if she was exactly on time. Uncle Richard often didn't look up from his newspaper, as though she were nothing more than a draft of cold air that happened to drift by. Emily felt the weight of those silences as deeply as if they were shouted words. Every sigh from Aunt Susan, every smirk from Lucas, every dismissive glance from Uncle Richard pressed into her heart like fresh bruises. The worst moments came during family dinners. The table was always set for 4, and though Emily sat there too, it was clear she wasn't really counted. Yet for all the coldness she faced at home, Emily refused to let her spirit break completely. The bookstore, too, became her refuge. Marlene taught Emily how to arrange displays and gently recommend books to customers who weren't sure what they wanted. Still, the exhaustion weighed on her body. There were days when her limbs felt heavy as stone, and her eyes stung from lack of sleep. A few weeks into working at the bookstore, Emily finally dared to open a small savings account at the local bank. Even as Emily built her small island of independence, Uncle Richard's shadow stretched long. Later that night, she wrote everything down in her notebook: the humiliation, the shame, the anger that boiled under her skin. Emily knew that the road ahead was still long, and there were nights when she doubted she had the strength to keep walking it. Ask ChatGPT. Emily's days began to stretch into what felt like an endless pattern of quiet endurance. Every morning, she would wake up before anyone else in the house stirred, tiptoeing across the cold wooden floorboards so she wouldn't wake Lucas or Hannah. She had learned not to draw attention to herself, because attention always seemed to bring fresh hurt. The walk there felt like crossing from one world into another. Marlene's smile at the door felt like a tiny rebellion against the loneliness that waited at home. Emily would push open the door to find Lucas sprawled on the couch or Hannah laughing at some new piece of gossip. Uncle Richard sat at the dining table, his eyes flickering with a cold disapproval the moment he noticed Emily. The quiet allowed her to write in her notebook, pouring out the things she couldn't say aloud. On some pages, she wrote angry words about Uncle Richard's cold eyes and Lucas's smirks. Emily hesitated, choosing her words carefully, because she had learned it was dangerous to reveal too much. "I'm just tired," she finally said, her voice soft. Hannah had bought a new dress and laughed about how Uncle Richard had paid for it without question. Lucas bragged about a weekend trip planned with his friends, while Emily silently calculated how many hours she'd need to work to cover next week's lunch money. Uncle Richard didn't look at her when she walked in, and Aunt Susan's eyes narrowed, as if Emily's very presence was an offense. Marlene didn't press further, but she reached out and squeezed Emily's hand. That small gesture warmed something inside Emily that had long been cold. It reminded her that there were still good people in the world, people who saw her not as a burden but as someone worth kindness. On others, she wrote her dreams, to study literature, to write stories that mattered, and to build a life where she could stand tall without fear. As she worked, she imagined her future self, in college, walking across campus with a backpack full of books, free from the fear of Uncle Richard's anger. The image felt so clear that it brought tears to her eyes, though she quickly wiped them away before Marlene could see. But under all of it, there was still that stubborn spark, the part of her that refused to give up. She had lost so much, but she still had her determination, her quiet courage, and her dreams. And even if no one else believed in her, she decided that she would keep believing in herself, because sometimes, that was all anyone had to keep going. That night, walking home, Emily held her notebook close, her mind repeating the words she had written earlier, "One day, I will leave this house behind." It felt like a promise, not just a hope. She would trace the words over and over, as if making them real by sheer will. Sometimes, she fell asleep at her desk, her cheek pressed against the paper, dreaming of a future that felt impossibly far away. Aunt Susan rarely spoke to her unless it was to correct something, the way Emily set the table, the way she walked, or the way she spoke too softly. Dinner conversations never included her, even though she sat right there. It felt like being trapped behind glass. She could see them, hear them, but she wasn't really allowed to be part of them. At the bookstore, Emily felt useful. She arranged books, helped customers, and learned the steady rhythm of the shop. "Lucas will be the first from this family to get into a real university," he said, glancing at Emily with a sharp, dismissive look that spoke louder than words. Emily swallowed her hurt, focusing on the plate in front of her, her fork tracing the pattern of mashed potatoes. She wanted to tell him that she, too, had college dreams, that she studied harder than anyone else in that house. But she knew better. Speaking up would only invite more cutting words, so she let the moment pass in silence. Marlene taught her how to listen carefully, to notice what a customer's eyes lingered on even if their words said something different. Emily treasured every lesson, every kind word. She saved her wages faithfully, every dollar folded carefully into her savings account. Instead of hating her cousins for the way they treated her, she chose to see them as reminders of what she never wanted to become. Lucas, with his easy arrogance, and Hannah, with her careless cruelty, seemed so certain they deserved everything they had. Emily, on the other hand, knew the value of each small step she earned on her own. And that quiet knowledge kept her moving forward even when the days felt impossibly long. The small balance was growing, and though it was nowhere near enough for college, it was hers, and that meant everything. But in the moments when she lifted her eyes and saw the sunlight falling through the library windows, she remembered that life still had gentle corners. It was during these breaks in the school library, surrounded by shelves of words and stories, that she felt something close to belonging. Sometimes, she would pause and look around, letting herself pretend that she was just another girl with a family waiting at home who loved her without conditions. The thought always stung, but she let herself hold it for a moment before she tucked it away again. The dawn light through her small window painted the walls in pale gold, a soft promise that maybe today would be different, even though it rarely was. She dressed quietly, packing her books and her notebook where she scribbled down everything she dared not say out loud. In that notebook, she could write her pain, her fears, and her stubborn dreams of escaping the grip her uncle had on her life. At school, she blended in with the other students, head down, shoulders slightly hunched. After classes ended, she would hurry to the bookstore, careful not to waste even a minute. The evenings, however, were always the hardest. One evening, Uncle Richard mentioned Lucas's college applications, his voice heavy with pride. Nights in her room were both the safest and loneliest part of Emily's day. Yet even in her hardest moments, Emily refused to let bitterness completely take root. At the bookstore, Marlene noticed Emily's exhaustion. One afternoon, when the shop was quiet, she gently asked, "Emily, are you all right?" One Friday evening, Emily stayed late at the bookstore to help reorganize a new shipment of books. But back at the house, the contrast between her dreams and reality felt sharper than ever. That night, lying awake in bed, Emily felt the weight of everything pressing on her, the unfairness of it all, the grief for her parents that never fully left, and the exhaustion of pretending she was fine. Emily's life at home had settled into an exhausting routine that felt impossible to escape, but deep inside, she clung to the hope that something better was waiting beyond the suffocating walls of her uncle's house. Her teachers saw the dedication in her eyes, the way she always had her homework ready, and how she would stay behind to ask questions. They didn't know that her life at home offered little support, or that every word of encouragement they gave her felt like a lifeline. Dinner time was always the hardest. Uncle Richard would speak proudly of Lucas's sports achievements or Hannah's new clothes, his voice dripping with pride that Emily knew she would never hear directed at her. He tossed a remark at her about how pathetic it was that she spent her weekends working instead of doing something fun. His words stung, but Emily had learned not to react. She kept her plans secret, knowing that revealing them to her family would only bring scorn. And her cousins kept flaunting every new privilege they enjoyed. But something inside Emily was changing. She stopped waiting for kindness that would never come. Instead, she began to quietly claim power over the things she could control, her savings account balance growing a little each week. Each day, she woke up and chose to keep going. Each night, she reminded herself that she was more than what they saw. And while the road ahead still looked uncertain and hard, Emily felt something growing stronger inside her, hope, stubborn and steady, that she would one day step beyond that door and never have to look back. Her essays for scholarship applications drafted carefully late into the night, and her belief that she deserved better than the life her uncle offered. Marlene noticed Emily's quiet focus and offered gentle encouragement. "You're stronger than you think," she told her one evening, as they restocked shelves together. She applied for every scholarship she could find, wrote essays late into the night, and saved every dollar she earned. At school, she kept her grades high, knowing it might make a difference. And through it all, she kept her dream close to her heart, to walk across a college campus one day, to belong somewhere by her own efforts, not because someone handed it to her, but because she fought for it. Those words stayed with Emily long after she left the shop, repeating in her mind like a quiet prayer. She moved past him quietly, hiding the way her hands trembled. In her room, she sat on the bed, letting silent tears fall, not because she believed what Lucas said. For the first time, she didn't see just a frightened, unwanted girl. She saw someone who had survived so much already, someone who kept moving forward even when it would have been easier to give up. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it did give her something new, a quiet respect for herself that no one else in that house could take away. But because the cruelty of it, coming from someone she had once called family, cut deeper than she cared to admit. Her cousins, wrapped in their own worlds, rarely bothered to look in her direction unless it was to sneer or make a careless comment. It wasn't anything grand at first, just small ideas, researching scholarships, asking Marlene for advice about college applications, and listing every expense she might face. Writing it all down made it feel possible, like building a fragile bridge out of the place she was trapped in. Slowly, her sadness gave way to determination. She decided that even if her uncle refused to help, she would find another way. The meal would end with dishes left for Emily to clean, a reminder that in this house, her role was that of an outsider. Each scrape of a plate felt like an unspoken insult, and yet she quietly bore it all, her mind always whispering that this wasn't forever. Emily kept her head down, never bragging about her grades, never speaking of the long hours she spent working at the bookstore. Sometimes, she would press her hand against her chest, trying to slow the anxious beat of her heart. She wrote in her notebook late into the night, her handwriting shaky at times from exhaustion. On those pages, she confessed her anger, her sadness, and her hope. She wrote about missing her parents, wondering how different her life would be if they were still alive. She imagined conversations with them, what they might say to comfort her, how they might tell her to keep going, to remember that her worth wasn't measured by Uncle Richard's approval. But there was something about her presence, a kind of silent strength, that some classmates respected, even if they didn't understand where it came from. Each morning, she woke before the sun rose, slipping out of bed quietly to avoid waking anyone else. Marlene had become more than just her employer, she had grown into a quiet mentor and, in many ways, the closest thing to family Emily had left. Sometimes, Marlene shared stories of her own struggles from years ago, how she built the shop from nothing, faced disappointments, and kept going despite everything. Emily listened carefully, drawing strength from Marlene's honesty. It reminded her that people could start with very little and still build something meaningful. In those moments, Emily didn't feel like a lost, forgotten girl anymore, she felt like someone with the power to shape her own life, however slowly. Her room felt like a prison most days, yet there were small comforts, the way the morning light crept across her notebook, the faint rustle of pages as she wrote down thoughts she dared not speak, and the fragile hope that tomorrow might bring change. Her body felt heavy with tiredness, her eyes often stinging from late nights spent studying after work, but she pushed herself forward because she refused to let her uncle's neglect define the rest of her life. At school, Emily's quiet determination set her apart, though few noticed it. Outside school hours, Emily hurried to the bookstore, where the smell of paper and ink wrapped around her like a blanket. Still, the contrast between her days at the bookstore and her nights at home felt brutal. In the moments when she could slip away to her room, Emily let herself feel the weight of it all. One Saturday evening, after another long day at the bookstore, Emily returned home to find Lucas waiting in the hallway. But that night, instead of letting the pain overwhelm her, Emily opened her notebook and started to plan. Over the weeks that followed, Emily spent every free moment in the library or the bookstore's quiet back room, poring over college guides and scholarship websites. At home, nothing changed on the surface. Uncle Richard still treated her as invisible, Aunt Susan still frowned at her every move. One evening, while cleaning the kitchen, Emily caught her reflection in the dark window. As winter turned to spring, Emily's plan slowly began to take shape. The house remained cold, her uncle's approval remained withheld, and her cousin's cruelty continued. But Emily no longer let those things define her. Emily's days grew longer as spring deepened into summer, and the weight of everything she had been carrying felt heavier than ever. Yet somewhere inside, she discovered a quiet courage she hadn't known she possessed. Every morning, she woke before dawn, washing her face in cold water to fight off the lingering exhaustion. Lucas took every opportunity to mock her hand-me-down clothes or the long hours she worked. She wrote scholarship essays late into the night, the lamplight the only witness to her quiet ambition. She saved every cent she could from the bookstore, even skipping lunch some days to stretch her money further. Marlene, seeing her determination, quietly increased her hours, pretending it was because the store was busier than usual. Emily understood what Marlene was doing, but she didn't argue. She needed the money too badly. Hannah, always draped in new outfits and the latest shoes, would roll her eyes and laugh whenever Emily walked past. But Emily knew the hardest part still lay ahead, telling her uncle. When she stepped through the front door, Uncle Richard barely looked up from his chair. She quietly packed her few belongings, her hands shaking with excitement and fear. She knew it wouldn't all be easy. She would still have to work hard to cover what the scholarship didn't. But for the first time in years, her future felt like something she could shape, not something controlled by her uncle's grudges. At the bookstore, Marlene offered to help with supplies Emily might need, refusing to take no for an answer. Emily accepted gratefully, overwhelmed by the kindness she had rarely known. "Where have you been?" he demanded. Emily's heart pounded, but she took a deep breath and said quietly, "I got into college. And I got a scholarship." For a moment, there was silence. Tomorrow, she would step into a life she had built for herself. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers. And for a girl who had grown up surrounded by people who tried to keep her small, that felt like the greatest revenge of all, not in anger but in living a life far bigger than anyone had ever believed she could. Then he scoffed, "A scholarship? That doesn't change anything. You still think you're better than us?" His words hurt, but not like before. Something inside Emily had shifted. His approval no longer felt necessary. She had done it all in secret, terrified of what her uncle would do if he found out. For the first time, she realized their opinions didn't define her. She had built this opportunity herself, with no help from any of them. Later, alone in her room, she let herself cry, not out of sadness, but because the years of struggle, the loneliness, the countless nights spent worrying had finally led to this small victory. Her heart raced as she clicked submit, knowing her entire future now hung on those words she had poured her heart into. She didn't allow herself to dream too much, but the spark of hope was there, a flicker she refused to extinguish. "Emily, what is it?" she asked, concern etched on her face. Emily could barely speak, but finally she whispered, "I got in. And they're giving me a scholarship." Marlene's face lit up, and without hesitation, she wrapped Emily in a hug, holding her tightly. "I knew you would," she said softly, and Emily let herself believe, just for that moment, that maybe she truly did deserve this. One afternoon, Emily returned home to find her few treasured belongings, old family photos, a second-hand paperback she loved, thrown on the floor and stepped on. Emily worked, studied, and endured her uncle's sharp tongue and her cousin's mockery as best she could. Nights were the hardest. Lying in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, the doubts would whisper that maybe Uncle Richard was right, that maybe she didn't deserve anything better. But she would force herself to remember the long hours she had worked, the essays she had written, the kindness Marlene had shown, and the strength it had taken just to get this far. She knew exactly who had done it, but she stayed silent, picking them up one by one, her hands trembling. She hesitated, hands shaking, afraid to open it. But something stronger than fear pushed her forward, and as she read the words, her breath caught in her throat. She had been accepted into her first-choice college, and not only that, but they had awarded her a scholarship that covered nearly everything. For a moment, the world blurred through her tears. Relief, pride, and disbelief crashed over her all at once, so powerful she had to sit down to keep from falling over. Alone in her room later, she cried softly, pressing the bent photo of her parents to her chest, promising them she wouldn't let anger destroy her focus. And forcing herself to smile in the mirror even if it felt false. The bookstore remained her one safe space, the place where she could breathe without judgment. Marlene noticed how pale and tired she looked but didn't push her with questions. Instead, she offered small kindnesses, a warm cup of tea, a gentle pat on the shoulder, and once, a short note slipped into Emily's bag that simply read, "You matter more than you think." Emily kept that note hidden inside her notebook, reading it again whenever the darkness felt too close. At home, things had not softened at all. If anything, Uncle Richard seemed more bitter, his words sharper, as if Emily's quiet persistence somehow threatened him. One evening, as she sat at the dinner table in silence, he complained about the rising costs of living, turning his gaze toward Emily in a way that made her stomach twist. "And you," he spat, "always taking up space and giving nothing back. A real burden." The words stung deeply, but Emily had learned to keep her face still. Inside, though, it fueled her determination. She would prove, even if only to herself, that she wasn't a burden at all. Emily's cousins, Lucas and Hannah, remained as cruel as ever. Despite everything, Emily pushed forward with her college plans. The day finally came when Emily submitted her college applications. Weeks passed in anxious waiting, each day heavy with uncertainty. Then, one late afternoon, as Emily was closing up the bookstore, her phone buzzed with an email notification. Marlene found her moments later, still clutching the phone, her face wet with tears. The walk home that evening felt different. The air seemed lighter, and even the cracked sidewalk felt like a path leading somewhere better. Lucas muttered something under his breath about how pathetic it was, and Hannah rolled her eyes, but Emily stood her ground. As the weeks moved forward, Emily focused on preparing to leave. Each night, she lay awake imagining her life to come, a small dorm room of her own, new faces who wouldn't see her as a burden, and the chance to learn without being constantly belittled. On her last night in that house, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling that had once felt like a prison. Emily woke before sunrise on the morning she was to leave, the familiar cracks in the ceiling above her bed tinged with the soft orange glow of dawn. She lay there for a few moments, her heart pounding in a mix of fear and hope, taking in every detail of the room she had called hers for so many painful years. Part of her had hoped for something, maybe even the smallest sign of approval, but his face remained stone. Lucas smirked. "College girl, huh? Don't forget where you came from." Hannah barely looked up from her phone. Marlene had offered to give her a ride to the bus station. "You're going to do great things," Marlene whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. Emily stepped onto the bus, her suitcase bumping against the narrow aisle, and found a window seat. The buildings were grander than anything she had known, brick facades with ivy curling up their sides and students moving across the quad, their laughter echoing. Emily's heart raced, part excitement, part fear that maybe she didn't belong. But she took a deep breath, gripping her suitcase, and walked forward. Emily watched groups of students chatting and laughing, and while a flicker of loneliness stirred in her chest, it was quickly replaced by hope. Here, no one knew her as the poor orphan girl living under her uncle's shadow. And as she closed her eyes, Emily silently promised herself she wouldn't let anything, or anyone, take this away. For the first time, the future felt like it truly belonged to her. Here, she could simply be Emily, the girl who had fought her way to this moment. As the engine rumbled to life and the bus began to pull away, Emily pressed her forehead to the glass, watching the familiar streets blur into the distance. Her room was on the third floor of an old dormitory, the hallway echoing with the sounds of other students unpacking, greeting each other with eager smiles. She placed the framed photo of her parents on the desk, smoothing the glass with her fingertips. She opened her notebook and, in careful handwriting, wrote a single sentence at the top of a fresh page: "This is my chance." Her heart felt lighter than it had in years. Emily stepped inside her new room, a small, sunlit space with plain walls, a single bed, and a narrow desk. She sat on the bed, her suitcase beside her, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She opened a book she had brought from the bookstore, its pages worn from years of reading, and began to read. Outside, the soft sounds of other students settling into their new lives drifted through the open window. Emily listened to the gentle rhythm, letting it soothe the lingering fear inside her. For the first time in so long, she felt safe. Each mile felt like shedding another layer of fear and doubt, revealing something stronger beneath. And Emily felt a lump rise in her throat when she saw Marlene's small, reliable car parked by the curb. Marlene stepped out, her smile warm and soft. "Ready?" she asked. Emily nodded, her voice caught between relief and sadness. As they drove, Marlene talked gently about what to expect at college: new faces, crowded hallways, late-night study sessions, and Emily listened, soaking in every word like sunlight after a long winter. Emily didn't respond, not because she couldn't, but because she had realized they weren't worth the words anymore. She picked up her suitcase, the handle rough against her palm, and took one last look at the place that had never felt like home. Her mind raced with plans: the classes she wanted to take, the part-time jobs she might find, the small rooms she'd decorate however she liked. She knew money would still be tight, and that balancing work and study would be exhausting. But there was a difference now. This struggle was for her own future, not just for survival under someone else's roof. She imagined late nights in the library, coffee cups beside stacks of books, and the quiet pride of handing in a paper she had poured her heart into. Without another word, she stepped out the front door, closing it quietly behind her. "Don't expect to come crawling back here when it doesn't work out," he muttered, crossing his arms. His words stung, but the difference now was that Emily no longer believed them. She knew this wasn't about her failing, it was about him wanting her to. "I won't," she replied softly, steadying her voice. "I'm going to make it work." Her uncle scoffed and turned away, as if the conversation bored him, and Emily felt the final thread snap between them. The peeling wallpaper, the faded rug by the bed, and the dent in the wooden dresser from when Lucas had slammed the door too hard one afternoon. All of it seemed to blur together into something she was ready to leave behind, even if a part of her still felt the ache of memories tied to this place. She quietly got up, careful not to wake anyone, and pulled her small suitcase from under the bed. It was worn, its edges frayed, and its zipper stubborn, but it held the few pieces of clothing she owned, her battered notebook filled with thoughts and dreams, and a single framed photo of her parents she had kept hidden from her uncle's reach. As she packed, her hands trembled, not just from the weight of leaving but from the fear of what lay ahead. Downstairs, the house was silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock. Emily took a deep breath, bracing herself for whatever words might come when her uncle woke. She had imagined this moment so many times, standing tall, telling him she was leaving for college, that she had earned it on her own. But now that the moment had arrived, the words seemed trapped in her chest. She stepped into the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water, her fingers brushing against the cold sink as if grounding herself. She heard the creak of the stairs and turned to see Uncle Richard standing there, his eyes heavy with the usual mix of indifference and irritation. "So," he said flatly, his voice rough with sleep, "today's the day, huh?" Emily nodded, gripping the edge of the counter. Lucas and Hannah came downstairs soon after, still in pajamas, their expressions blank with mild curiosity. Outside, the morning air felt cool and strangely freeing. Emily took a long breath, savoring the taste of possibility. At the bus station, Emily hugged Marlene tightly, whispering 1,000 silent thank yous she couldn't say out loud. The bus ride was long, but Emily barely noticed. When she finally arrived at the college campus, Emily stepped off the bus and stood still for a moment, overwhelmed. In the admissions office, she signed her name shakily on forms, receiving her dorm key and a thin campus map. That evening, as the sun set outside her window, Emily unpacked her few belongings. She spent the next hours exploring the campus, wandering through the library's hushed aisles and finding hidden corners where she could imagine herself studying late at night. As night settled over the campus, Emily returned to her room, turning on the small desk lamp. She lay down in bed later, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, and felt something she hadn't known in a long time: hope that tomorrow could be better. Samantha felt like the days were running faster than ever, yet the memories of the past kept following her like a long shadow. She had come so far from those first nights when she had cried herself to sleep on the small mattress in her uncle's spare room. Samantha had never thought of herself as someone who could lead others, but slowly, her boss had begun giving her extra tasks, trusting her judgment on important projects. It felt strange at first, being trusted after so many years of being made to feel worthless. The summer breeze carried the smell of grass and distant flowers. She didn't speak out loud but quietly shared updates in her mind, telling him about her small victories and moments of doubt. This time, she accepted with a calm nod, telling herself she could learn whatever she needed along the way. The team listened to her ideas, and some even sought her advice. Reading those words, Samantha didn't feel the rush of anger she might have felt before. A cup of tea after a long day, a message from a friend checking in, or the sight of the golden leaves falling outside her window. Each moment felt like proof that pain doesn't last forever, and that hope could grow even in the hardest soil. She no longer chased revenge as an end, she saw it as a result of living well. And so, day by day, she kept walking forward, stronger, calmer, and more certain of who she had become. Instead, she felt a deep, quiet understanding that some people never changed. And maybe that was the true revenge, living a life that proved his words had been wrong all along. Her existence, her success, her quiet strength stood as a silent answer to every insult and every injustice. She couldn't stop herself from feeling nervous sometimes, but she no longer let it stop her. In those moments, she remembered the long nights she had spent teaching herself new skills, reading books borrowed from the library when she had no money to buy her own. That stubborn will to keep going had brought her here. Standing there, she realized how much she missed his gentle voice and steady presence. But at the same time, she also realized she had grown stronger than she had ever believed possible. Her father's memory wasn't just a wound anymore, it had become part of her strength. The thought comforted her, and she felt a strange sense of connection, like he would be proud of her for not giving up. She thought about how different her life was from just a few years ago. Back then, she had felt so small, almost invisible, walking back to her uncle's house, afraid of what mood he might be in. She remembered doing homework on the kitchen table while her cousins made fun of her, and how she had wished she could disappear. Now she felt something close to peace. It wasn't a perfect peace, but it was hers. The girl who once cried over lost college dreams had become a woman who carved her own path. Yet day by day, she grew into this new role. It was like she was finally meeting the person she had always been inside but never dared to show. She found strength in simple routines, like making notes in her planner or staying late to double-check her work. The town's whispers grew louder, and Samantha felt both relief and sadness. Part of her wished things had been different, that he had chosen kindness over greed. But she knew she couldn't change the past. She had learned that lesson the hard way. The only thing she could change was herself and the life she chose to build. There were evenings when she still felt tired and wondered if she could keep going, but each time, she reminded herself of why she had started. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about proving to herself that she could survive and do well. Those memories were still there, but now they didn't hurt in the same way. Instead, they reminded her of how far she had come. Every morning she would wake up, make her coffee, and look around at her own little apartment, still a bit surprised that all of it truly belonged to her. It wasn't grand, but it was hers alone, a space that no one could take away. She had painted the walls herself, chosen every piece of furniture, and carefully added small touches that made the place feel warm and alive. At work, people had started to notice her even more. Her uncle's family, on the other hand, had begun facing troubles of their own. It started with small things, arguments between her cousins about money, then bigger issues like unpaid bills and failed business plans. Word reached Samantha through people in town who still remembered how her father had been generous and respected. Some people asked her if she had heard about what was happening, and though it stirred feelings of bitterness at first, Samantha tried to stay calm. She realized it wasn't her place to celebrate their problems, even if part of her had once dreamed of seeing them fall. What mattered more was the life she was building, step by step. One day after work, Samantha sat on a park bench under the quiet shade of an old tree. Later that week, Samantha visited her father's grave again, something she had started doing more often. Things continued to shift around her. At work, Samantha was asked to lead a new project, something that would have terrified her before. Meanwhile, her uncle's troubles grew heavier. His business suffered from bad investments, and even people who used to support him began keeping their distance. One evening, Samantha received a message from an old neighbor, telling her how her uncle had blamed everything on bad luck, never admitting what he had done to her. As summer turned to autumn, Samantha noticed how even the small things brought her happiness. Autumn deepened and the city felt softer under its fading sun, and Samantha often found herself walking home slowly just to watch the leaves fall. Each step felt different now, lighter in some way, as if the weight she had carried for so long had finally loosened its grip. At work, her project had turned into something bigger than she had imagined, earning her quiet respect from people who barely knew her past struggles. Sometimes she caught herself smiling at her reflection in shop windows, surprised to see someone who looked calm, confident, and quietly proud. The contrast to the scared, tired girl who once walked those same streets was almost too large to believe. Yet she knew that both versions of her were real, and it was the painful, broken part that had taught her how to rebuild. One late afternoon, she decided to stop by her father's grave again, bringing a small bunch of autumn flowers she had picked up on the way. Standing there in the cool breeze, she closed her eyes and let herself remember the warm way her father used to hold her hand. The smell of old books in his study and the way his laughter had once made everything feel safe. She didn't cry this time. Instead, she spoke softly in her mind, telling him about her work, the respect she had finally earned, and how she no longer felt invisible. As she stood there, a strange warmth spread through her chest, not just sadness but something gentler, like acceptance and love mixed together. She walked home feeling grateful, even for the pain, because it had shown her what truly mattered. In the weeks that followed, she heard even more about her uncle's troubles. His business had failed completely, and the house she had once lived in was put up for sale. Some people might have felt satisfaction, but Samantha mostly felt a quiet sense of distance. She realized she no longer wanted revenge in the loud, burning way she had once imagined. What she had built was far more powerful, a life of her own choosing, shaped by kindness, effort, and quiet courage. The uncle who had taken so much had ended up trapped by his own greed, while she had found freedom in moving forward. One chilly morning, Samantha walked into her office and was asked to train a new employee. Looking at the young woman's nervous face reminded her of her own first days there, filled with fear and doubt. Speaking gently, Samantha offered help and encouragement, feeling something settle inside her. Maybe the greatest revenge wasn't proving her uncle wrong but becoming the kind of person who could lift others up instead of pushing them down. Her days grew full, sometimes tiring but always meaningful, and each evening she returned to her little apartment with its warm lamps and worn sofa that she had chosen herself. On weekends, she treated herself to quiet breakfasts in small cafes, reading books she had once only dreamed of owning. Sometimes she paused, looking around at people laughing, thinking how strange and beautiful life was, how the darkest chapters had led her here. She had come to understand that healing wasn't forgetting or pretending it hadn't hurt. Healing was carrying the story without letting it decide every tomorrow. At night, when the city outside her window quieted down, she lay in bed remembering everything, the good, the terrible, and the long days of doubt, and still felt thankful. Even the pain had shaped her strength, taught her to value what truly mattered. In her heart, she wished her uncle had chosen kindness, but she no longer needed him to change. His choices were his, and hers were hers. The difference was that she had chosen love over bitterness, growth over blame, and in that choice, she had discovered who she really was. The girl who once felt like nothing had become a woman who built her own place in the world, step by careful step, and that was something no one could ever take away. And so each new morning Samantha opened her eyes not just to a new day but to a life she had crafted with her own quiet stubborn hope, and though the journey had left scars it had also left her free.